Hey everyone, welcome to the Story Builder podcast. I am thrilled to be with Shawn Smucker. He is an author, a writing coach, and a podcaster, and he also is co-owner of a bookstore. Thanks so much for being with me, Shawn.
Yeah, hey Jim, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'm so stoked to have you on the show here because you are such an accomplished writer. I feel like you're one of the first writers I know that kind of branched off. When I read your first book, I remember it was like you were nonfiction, working on nonfiction. You're like, by the way, I wrote a novel. And I was like, ooh, you can do that. So you kind of actually really inspired me. And it was like a green light, like, yeah, you can do that. You can go from here to over here and you can kind of do what you want. So thanks again, Shawn. Appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks, man.
What are some of your favorite stories, like looking back, or anything that just stands out to you? Because I think there's sometimes like we learn from them and grow. They grow with us, and they sometimes even change us.
Yeah, so the first one that comes to mind is when I was about 7 or 8 years old. A Sunday school teacher started reading *The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe* to us, and I think they only read like the first couple of chapters, but I was hooked immediately. I had never, my mom read to me a lot when I was a kid, picture books and things like that, but that was probably the first sort of chapter book. Back then we didn't really have chapter books. It was like picture books and then jumping into sort of early reader stuff. And um, yeah, hearing that story, it totally, it changed me. Like it awakened in me a love of stories that I didn't necessarily know was there. And I remember that night just begging my parents to get me the box set, which they had at the bookstore. And I still have the box. I think I may have lost one or two of the books, but I still have the box that it came in. And it was like $11.92 for the box. And my parents got it for me. And I read through that series over and over and over again, from the time I was 7 or 8 or 9 until, through my teenage years. But that was really the first story that had a big impact on me. And I think even in the way that I looked at life, from that point on, I was very much looking for things in the margins of reality, like the things that maybe can't be explained, or the sort of interesting things that happen. And so from there, it was like from there to The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, Susan Cooper, um, yeah, the Black Cauldron series. So a lot of fantasy early on, but then it was sort of, so I read a lot and decided I want to be an English major in college. And I don't know, the next sort of marker for me was in my freshman seminar in English. We read A Prayer for Owen Meany by John Irving. And that was really pivotal too, just in the way the story's told, the ending. And I think what that opened up for me was this idea that you can write about religion and spirituality, and it doesn't have to necessarily be a Christian novel. And so that was exciting for me.
Yeah, that's a game changer. Honestly, right? You're kind of like you think it's one way, and you're like, no, no, no.
Yeah,
That's
yeah, and game changers. Even the year before that, my senior year in high school, I took an AP English class. And so that was in the fall. So in the summer before, our teacher sent out a letter to all of us with the books we were going to be reading, and asked us that summer to read Catcher in the Rye before we came to class. And
yeah.
that, again, like I had never read anything like that before. Totally blew me away. And that's probably the reason I ended up becoming an English major in college, was having that AP English class my senior year.
That's fascinating. I remember the first time I read Catcher because I didn't read it in high school. I was
Okay.
like 30, and
Yeah.
I was like, whoa! If I would have read this in high school, guaranteed writer never would have remotely ever considered accounting. I would have been like, I want to do just like this because it's such
Yeah.
a different voice and different perspective. And I even find it funny where people like push back and they're like, "Oh, Holden, he's whiny. He's not a fun character. He's annoying or whatever." I'm kind of like, "Yeah." I can totally see that. I can totally see that. But I was like, but it sure struck a chord with me where I was like, this is really honest in a way that I didn't think a book had ever been that honest. And even hypocritical. I think it kind of goes with honesty. So yeah,
Hmm.
that one was definitely one for me. I think that's probably my favorite novel.
Mm,
Um,
yeah. Yeah.
Probably. So yeah, love that, Shawn. Now you've written a few novels over the years. I knew you took a little break, but it's funny how time blurs, especially post COVID, because it's like, and your covers, because they're so outdoor, like I
Mhm.
think I blurred one of the books together in my mind. But you have a
Yeah.
few here: Light from Distant Stars, These
Hmm.
Nameless Things, and then The Weight of Memory. That was
Hmm.
your most recent novel.
Yep.
And any insights looking back now, as I even just mentioned those? Like, I know it's kind of like having kids, and you know, does anything come up when I mention those books again? Because you probably haven't touched any of those in a while.
Yeah, actually, it was the first two, The Day the Angels Fell and The Edge of Over There,
Oh,
that
sorry, those are
really,
lower.
yeah, 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 yeah. No, I mean, so those I had self-published, or I had self-published, The Day the Angels Fell, and that was my entry into fiction. I was making a living as a co-writer and a ghostwriter, writing nonfiction, mostly memoirs for other people.
Mhm.
I had a friend of mine who said, when are you going to write a book for yourself?
Oh,
And sort of a similar time, I was working on a project for a guy who was dying of cancer, and he was 50 years old, and I was like 35 at the time, and I was thinking, wow, um, what am I waiting for? Like there's stuff I want to do, and I just keep putting it off. So that was the main impetus to moving into fiction. And so I wrote The Day the Angels Fell, self-published it, was really happy with the response, had a great sort of indie crowd of my own little audience, nothing huge, but it was a lot of fun and connecting with those readers. And so I wrote the sequel and was getting ready to self-publish the sequel, The Edge of Over There, when so in the meantime, I had picked up an agent to try and help me get more nonfiction writing work, co-writing, and she read The Day the Angels Fell and heard that I was releasing a sequel and was like, "Hey, wait a second, why don't you let me just shop this around and see what we can get?" And so
nice.
she did that, and that's when I got a traditional publisher to do those two, plus a third book, which was Light from Distant Stars.
Okay.
And then as soon as The Day the Angels Fell came out, the publisher wanted to sign me to two more. So that was These Nameless Things and The Weight of Memory.
Five.
So
Yeah.
five total. They came out from like 2017, 18, 19, 20, and 21.
One a year.
Um,
Yeah.
one a year. Yeah, I already had two of them, sort of the third one written. So the last two I sort of wrote over that 3 or 4 year time frame. The last two also came out during the pandemic, which was pretty rough. It was just, it was such a strange thing trying to release those
Right.
and get any kind of attention on that. So that kind of, I did leave a little bit of a sour taste in my mouth, those last two books, and haven't published anything since then for myself. So, but I continue to write.
Well, now, perfect transition, by the way. Now you're doing your next novel on Substack, which is really a cool concept here. Um, how you're putting it out there one chapter at a time. Um, Funny games we used to play. And I had to ask you about this because I'm like, I mean, we all have heard about this. I mean, it used to be blogging a novel kind of one chapter at a time. What's your approach with this? Because for me, I'm kind of like, I don't know when my book is done until I'm making passes, revisions, all the
Mm.
process, the drafting and all that. How are you kind of going through and just say, okay, here's this week's chapter, here's this week's
Mm-hmm.
chapter, here's this week's chapter.
Yeah, so funny games we used to play. I wrote the first iteration of this in probably 21, 22.
Okay.
I didn't get through the whole thing. I wrote like the first 40 or 50,000 words. So that's what I'm working with right now. The current
Gotcha.
chapters that I'm releasing are mostly just edits, of chapters that I had written the first draft of years ago. So that's
Nice.
helpful because I don't really have the
Yeah.
time right now to be, writing and revising and doing all that every single week.
Yeah, that's too
Um,
much to do it well.
yeah, yeah. So most chapters are around like between 1,500 and 2,500 words. I'll revise them leading up to the each week's release. I haven't. I do think I know what the ending is. So ideally, I start working ahead a little bit and getting those scheduled. But right now, I'm just kind of working on it week to week. I just missed releasing fiction. I missed sharing it with people. And I had, after 5 books, a
That's
book a
cool.
year is a bit much, I think, for me. But yeah. So it's been, let's see, 20, 21, 22, 21, I guess, would have been the weight of memory. So it's been 4 years,
Mhm.
4 or 5 years. And yeah, I was just ready to start sharing stuff again.
I like that you're not afraid to. I mean, obviously, part of it's just schedule and busyness of life, but you're not afraid to push pause. Whereas a lot of people, I feel like, kind of run, 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 run until they basically burn out. And I feel like you kind of prioritize rest within reason, or at least have some boundaries in as far as your writing goes. And you're like, okay, I'm pacing myself. And even what you said there with one novel a year, that's plenty from me. And I think
Mm.
it's like it's important to figure out your own rhythms and patterns and kind of what you can do versus, you know, writing a writing marathon all the time, where I feel like most writers kind of make that mistake where, I mean, I'll raise my hand. I'm guilty as sin of this too. But if if the writing's hard, like I mentioned earlier,
Mm.
writing a thriller is stressful and hard. It's not really the same, even if it's 500 words, but it's hard to do versus 1,500 and something that's a little more relaxed or rejuvenating. It doesn't
Mm.
add up. So you kind of have to almost be very honest and self aware. Is that kind of your angle?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of books out there that'll tell you what you should do, how many words to write a day,
Fair.
and I was part of that, I think, for a little while because I thought there was a formula. But the longer that I go, I think it's just so important for writers to figure out what works for them, and be writing regularly. But what does that look like? How many words is that in a week? What's your goal? Do you want to simply Substack and write essays, post essays, or shorter
Yeah.
shorter fiction, or do you want to write a book? My wife and I talk about this a lot because she's a writer and she's not a fast writer, and so for her, I don't know how practical it is for her to be writing a Substack and also working on a novel. Like that doesn't work for everybody. And so I think we have to be honest with ourselves about what we want to accomplish and what it's going to take to do that. The other thing that I've been thinking a lot about over the last couple of years, probably since my last novel came out, was this idea of it's easy for us as writers to always focus on what's measurable. And so, how many likes am I getting on my Substack post? How many shares? How many people are talking about it? How many books have I sold? How
Sure.
much am I getting in advance? The things that are measurable are really easy to talk about. But I think I think when it comes to writing, it's actually the things that can't be measured that are the most important. And for a lot of writers, that's just simply writing because it's a mental health exercise. It's something that we feel like we have to do, and so it's something that we need to do. And maybe we can't measure the results of that, but just simply sitting down every day and writing a little bit has some really important things happen in us
Sure.
and through us when we do that. And so, with the serialized novel that I'm putting on Substack, it would be easy to get discouraged on weeks when I don't get as many likes as I'd like or as many people
Right.
reading as I'd
The
like.
roller coaster from one week to the next. Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and but when I started it, I just felt like I'm not going to worry about that. I'm not going to worry about the measurable things. I'm just committed to posting this novel a week at a time until it's done.
Yeah.
And, you know, we'll see. Maybe in the eyes of a lot of people, it'll look like a waste of time, or it'll look like, oh man, you did a lot of work for like not much return. But I think it's important that we stop trying to measure everything,
Yeah.
and trust ourselves when it comes to what are we going to work on, what are we going to spend time on.
That's a great point because I don't know about you, Sean, and I'm not trying to speak for you, but like every book I've written has changed me for the better. And if I look back now, I'm like, oh, I went through this during this book, and I'm changed because of that. Or this book is like almost a time capsule of sorts. Oh, I was struggling with this
Mm,
relationship here.
yeah.
It made its way into my book, but if I don't tell you what it is, you might not catch it. And it's kind of like that, like you said, that therapy, that mental health practice there, where each book I'm looking back kind of going, I'm like, oh, I say it's about this, but it's really about something completely under the
Mm.
surface that, it is immeasurable. It's, as long as we're kind of that healing work in progress, trying to improve ourselves, that's actually a really big thing.
Yeah, creativity is so important. We all hear this all the time, and um, I think that can pretty easily get pushed to the back burner when we're just obsessed with like what's selling, what can I write that's going to sell, what can I write that's going to get me an advance.
Right.
So
That's a good point. I mean, that whole right to market angle of, hey, this is really hot right now, if I can jump on that thing's coattails, that's definitely a real thing. So that by default you're wanting to go as fast as humanly possible to get some of that success from something else that's really popular. And it's kind of like chasing the zeitgeist. And I feel like that's almost the opposite of what we're talking about with the immeasurable, isn't it?
yeah, it's I love how Rick Rubin talks about it in the Creative Act. He talks
Hmm.
about the audience comes last, and for me, that's been such an important concept. Even with the serialized novel, not to
Hmm.
be concerned about what people think or what they want or what they're looking for. Like, I just want to write something that I love, something that I'm super interested in, and really dive into that. And then the results are going to be what the results are going to be. But I can't obsess about what my readers are going to think or how they're going to respond.
Right. Right. Not too many of us are in the predicting, in that level. Mentioning Rick Rubin, I I remember in the creative act, it's like one thing that jumped at me was how he approaches editing. And I play guitar. I'm not like a formal musician. I played in a band years ago, but just the whole way he approaches, like, what are the best tracks? Let's build
Mhm.
it from the best part outward. And I kind of even took that a little bit toward editing. And I said, well, what are the best parts of my story? Let's focus on those first, especially because I don't know about you, Sean, but for me, so much fiction is like, oh, I went off the tracks here. I need to, save that for something else, or trim that off, or rework this. And it's like that whole positive part of like, let's focus on the good parts versus the negative. It's like a flipping the coin, because it's like when editing, usually it's like pull out the knife and start slashing it up into pieces. Whereas
Mhm.
Rick was like, no, find the parts you love and what can make those better. And I was like, that's just the other side of the coin, really. But it was
Mhm.
such a shift. I really loved that part because no one's ever saying that to writers working on novels. Like, yeah, focus on the parts you really love, and
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
makes that better.
Yeah. I love the story he tells about Johnny Cash. I think I may have seen this in a YouTube video or something, but Johnny Cash was not doing well in the
Mm,
late 70s, 80s. And Rick Rubin looked around the music industry and looked for someone who he felt was underappreciated, someone who was super talented but wasn't getting what Rick thought they deserved as far as laudits. And so, yeah, and he landed on Johnny Cash. He was like, he's playing in dinner theaters, he's playing in front of an audience of 50, 100 people.
Hmm.
And so Rick approached him, and one of the first things that he asked Johnny was, what music would you make if you just made what you loved? You know, like what would you
Hmm.
do if you just did what you loved? And so that turned into the America series of albums, and you know, lots of covers, lots of fun sort of Johnny Cash takes on some incredible songs. But I really think about that a lot now. You know, like what would I write today if I just wrote what I loved? What would I write today if I wrote something that I cared about, something that meant a lot to me? Um, you know, Rick Rubin says that we serve the audience the best when we do that. When we put the audience last, it's actually the best way of serving the audience because we end up creating those things that we love.
Do you find it a challenge when you're writing stories, like following a formula of sorts, like within story structure? I'm a bit of a structure guy, but I try to keep it open as well because it's like you can really hinder it when you start acting like everything is a screenplay. Um, but do you find it like, okay, I'm writing something I love. Oh, wait, I'm getting close to act 2 now. I need to have
Mm.
my, my big, the inciting incident, and then your turn into act 2. Do you think that way at all, or is it just me with my my own
I know a lot.
approach?
No, it's not just you. I know a lot of people think that way, but I don't necessarily think that way. I'm not sure why. I wonder if, like, I fell in love with reading at such a young age that I don't know. I didn't really think about structure as much as I thought about characters and the decisions that they were making. And so for me, when I write, I guess I just kind of fall back to that.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't. Yeah, I'm not sure. Obviously, that there's a best way. I think.
I think genre is a
Yeah.
big factor too.
Mm,
You know what I
yeah.
mean? Like I think genre like dictates some of these expectations, if you will.
Hmm.
We mentioned Catcher in the Rye. I couldn't give you an idea of like the turns and the arc, and
Mm,
I couldn't because it's like it's lot of little things in that story. You're focusing on one character. I remember a lot of it really well because it just sticks with you because that character sticks with you. But because of the genre being coming of age, it's a little, it's not like a western. There is no shootout at the end.
sure. Yeah.
um where it's like so many, it's almost like it's dictated a little bit by the type of story in that genre.
Hmm.
So I think that's probably a
Yeah.
factor.
No, I think that can be a factor. But I think it still comes back to the writer. You know, what's the writer more comfortable with? Because you also have sort of genre bending
It's
authors
true.
who
Learn them.
they write in particular genres, but they really defy a lot of the sort of standard practices. So, you know, if it was as easy as a formula, everybody would do it, and then everybody would sell books. But so I think there's still, whether you go with a structure or whether you don't go with a structure, I think there's still that sort of unknown thing about a story that just makes it really good and readable.
You typically not know what the end is going in. You're just kind of like, I'll find it eventually here.
I usually have a sense of what the ending is going to be at maybe 30 or 40%. So once I get to 30, 40, 50,000 words, then I start to realize, okay, this I think is the way that it's going. So I'll write in that direction, and that's generally what happens. I started doing that or thinking that way because when I
Mhm.
was younger in my 20s, some of the stories that I wrote, um, they would just kind of peter out, you know, and I didn't have, I felt like it was because I didn't really know where things were going. And so now when I write, it's a little bit of a mix of you know, plotting and not, and but usually about that point, I start to think a little bit more proactively about, okay, what could this be going towards?
Makes sense. Makes sense. So as you're going through the Substack, what's it been like for you doing the Substack? You are enjoy. You said kind of a hint that you're enjoying it for the most part because you're doing it for you first, just for fun, not focusing on numbers. You have kind of a queue of stories already built up, other than whatever revisions you want to make.
Mhm.
Has it been a good experience? Would you recommend it even other authors to try?
I love it. Yeah, I love it. I think it works for me because I'm at a particular point in my novel writing career where, I don't have a contract. So there's a lot of things that would come into it. Like obviously you don't want to I don't think you should serialize a novel that you really have high hopes of publishing with a traditional publisher. Um, I don't know that you should serialize a novel if it's your first novel and you're just kind of finding your way. Maybe. I don't know. Maybe that's not the case, but for me anyway, where I'm at right now, my agent is shopping a different novel around, so I'm kind of in a waiting period. Um, it's a good time for me, and it's I don't know, it kind of keeps my creative juices flowing, I guess. So
Yeah.
um, yeah.
How do you balance client work with your fiction writing, with also co-owning a bookstore and being a dad and a friend and all the other things? How do you, I mean, like, is it pretty much you chunk your work? Because I feel like that's almost the only approach you could really have. Be like, okay, I'm doing this for an X amount of time. I'm doing this for X amount of time.
Yeah, balance is a word Miley and I've kind of thrown out
Okay.
recently. We are so far in over our heads in some ways that our margin, I can't remember the term that Miley uses, margin for something, has been really, really stretched. So, you know, 2 years ago, if I would have looked at my schedule now, I'd have been like, there's no way. Like I can't do that.
Yeah.
But there are just so many good things that came to us in the span of the last year or so. Whether it's client work, opportunities to write fiction, the bookshop, our kids being into stuff. We've got 6 kids and they all have their own interests and passions and things that they do. And so trying to keep up with them, it's really just a day at a time, a week at a time.
Makes
And
sense
I
to
think
me.
that's one of the reasons that I leaned into the Substack thing, because it allowed me to keep working on fiction
Yeah.
in a time of my life when I don't have a ton of time to write new first draft words. So I can spend an evening or a couple of evenings editing a chapter that's coming out that week or the following week, and that
Mhm.
that helps me to sort of scratch that fiction itch.
Sure.
Yeah.
It makes sense. I mean, it's clear. You kind of already have it broken into pieces, and it's not like messing and mucking around in an 80,000 Word doc. I mean, to
Yeah.
me, that's always, personally, I'm a Scrivener guy because Word, I just kind of get
Mhm.
lost in the mix because it gets
Mhm.
so big. But
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Where it's like once you're in a really big doc, it's like, ugh. But if you kind of chunk it out like that, that makes a lot of sense. And I
Yeah.
respect what you're saying about balance too. I totally get that because the one day at a time is like, this is manageable
Mm.
this week. I'm not saying even that far is manageable, but it's a lot better
Yeah.
than the overwhelm that could come when you start getting bigger and bigger. And
Mhm.
you know,
Yeah.
people like that ask that, what's your 5-year plan or whatever, all that stuff. I'm like laughing at them. I'm like, I don't have a response. I'm like,
Yeah.
I don't know. Tell good stories. That's about
Yeah.
it. Any words of advice for other writers who are struggling, kind of probably maybe they feel like they're not known, or they're just on the verge of breaking through, or um writing's pretty lonely by default. It usually is, unless you're getting like some hint of interaction with someone, some kind
Mhm.
of reader or something. It can be really lonely.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, as I've gotten older, I think it's easy when you're in your 20s and 30s to have certain hopes and expectations and dreams and things like that, and I get that. But I think as you get older, you start to realize if the writing alone isn't enough, um, I don't see how it can be a long term interest, or I just don't see how we can stick with it long term. Because for too many of us at too many different phases of the process,
Hmm.
there's just no real reason to keep going if the writing isn't
If
enough.
you're not enjoying it or
Um,
get something out of it.
yeah, because the money is probably never going to be enough. I mean, 99.9% of people write will not make enough money for that to be their main job.
Right.
Um, if it's about being known or having followers or being famous, again, 99.9% of us are not going to have more than a couple hundred, maybe 500, maybe 1,000 at the most. Like that's a lot, but we're just not going to have that many people who are interested in our work. So the reality of the situation is that the writing has to be enough, and to sit down every day or 3 or 4 times a week and to go into these stories that we're making up and to just enjoy that is really the most important part.
I like that. It goes back to what you were saying earlier about what do you love, what do you really enjoy, versus a lot of things you can't
Yeah.
necessarily control.
Yeah.
Um, Focusing on enjoying the act of writing, that's huge.
Yeah.
That's huge. And almost too, it can suck away some of the frustration, because if you're focusing on the parts you enjoy, some of the other stuff, it can kind of fall to the wayside a little bit.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure. The writing can get you through some of the harder times, like if you love the writing and you can commit to the writing, then you can wait for months while you're querying agents, or you can wait a year or two while your agent is querying your novel. Like those are the things that a lot of people don't talk about or think about, like the sort of midway successes where,
sure.
oh, I got an agent. This is amazing. Okay, well, there's still a long road ahead.
Yeah, it's
And
a
when they
mile
start
marker.
shopping your novel, yeah, it could still be a really long road. So it's during those long, slow times when, if the writing is enough, then you can fall back on that, and that can kind of keep you going.
I love that. Now, you and Miley bought a bookstore literally a year ago, pretty much.
Hmm.
A few weeks ago, right? It was the 1 year anniversary,
Yeah.
called Nooks in downtown Lancaster.
Hmm.
Tell me a little bit about that adventure and just a little more about your store.
Yeah. So Nooks was in town for 3 or 4 years, and for most of that time, it was a children's bookshop, about 200 or 300 square feet, really small,
Okay.
but just a beautiful place, a whimsical place that a lot of people in the community loved. And so Emma, who owned the shop, she moved it into a bigger space.
Nice.
Let's see, that was in October of 2023.
Mhm.
Yeah. And then by the beginning of 2024, she's got 2 small kids and was feeling pretty overwhelmed and decided to close the shop. And so Miley and I heard about this. We'd always wanted to open a bookshop, but I don't think either of us really saw it happening until later in life,
Right. Right.
probably in our 60s. But this was an opportunity we had to look into. So we got in touch with Emma and talked with her, and so over the series of months, yeah, we ended up taking over the shop and reopened it. Closed for a couple of months. Reopened May of 2024.
Wow.
And it's just been a crazy, crazy ride since then.
I can only imagine. I can only imagine. That's
Yeah.
awesome, though. A friend of mine has a bookstore locally here, and it's almost the same kind of story where it's like, I didn't plan on this, but I love
Mm.
books and always wanted to do it. And not saying no, obviously, is a big factor, and
Yeah.
kind of that wonder and joy that you followed. That's fantastic. And I know, for like, I've seen some of the updates and things, Sean. It's like they closed down. No, you had was it a flood?
Yeah, well, it
And then they
started. We
closed your
first
street,
it
maybe?
was first the sidewalk has been closed for about
Right.
8 months now as they put up
Oh,
another apartment complex, and that's been really rough.
yeah.
And then, yeah, 3 or 4 weeks ago, we had a leak in an apartment above us that came down through the building into the
Ugh.
bookshop, and so we lost a lot of books, and it was just a real mess. There's always a challenge, there's always something. And so it's the beautiful thing about the bookshop again, it comes down to immeasurables, right? I mean, you got to be able to pay the bills, so there has to be some sort of measurable goal
Right.
there on that
Right.
side. But beyond that, really, the beauty of the bookshop is the connections, the community, the people that we get to meet, the books that we get to sell to people, place in people's hands. Like, it's
Yeah.
such a beautiful thing, and we both are really honored that we get to do it.
That's so great. And now I know that you guys are on bookshop.org, which is something that we can all support Nooks no matter where we live by using bookshop.org, because let's be honest, Amazon pretty much undercuts and does a lot of different things that make it really hard for indie bookstores to exist. Bookshop.org, you want to talk about that just for a moment?
Yeah, sure. Anybody who wants to buy from or support our shop, um, go to bookshop.org, select Nooks, Nooks, as your local bookshop, and then we get a portion of any sales under that. So it's been a huge help for us in these months, especially with the construction. We've got people from all over the country who are buying books that way. You can also buy books by emailing us, hello@nooks.gallery.
Awesome.
But Bookshop is really simple, and yeah, it's a great option. So we are so thankful for people who do that.
I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, or if you don't know this, it's totally fine, Shawn. I believe Ingram Spark is like partnered with bookshop.org. So if you're
That
on
wouldn't
Ingram
surprise me.
Spark,
Yeah.
I'm 80 to 90% sure, because I was,
Hmm.
publishing my own books, going through it. It was like,
Hmm.
if you're on Ingram Spark, so even if you're self-published, if you're on Ingram Spark, available there, it's very likely available on bookshop.org. So you don't even have to just think, oh, I only have to go to Amazon or
Hmm. Yeah.
other places. So
Yeah.
that was kind of eye opening for me, because there's so much distribution through Ingram that
Hmm.
there's a lot available there. That's
Yeah.
fantastic. I love that, Shawn.
Yeah.
And I'm going to include the link for your bookshop as well, for your store in the show notes that I list here. Any parting words? Thank you so much for being with me. I really appreciate your honesty. You are so honest, Shawn.
No, it's great to see you again, Jim. I think what we met in 2012, was it 2012 at Brian Elaine's conference? Is that
I
right?
found out about you through that. I was in
Okay.
Nashville, but I did not get to meet you right then. So I've been kind
Okay.
of like circling in your radar ever since then, though. I don't know
Yeah.
how I missed you at that, but yeah.
Yeah. No, I remember you standing up for something and introducing yourself. And so yeah, same. You've been on my radar ever
Awesome.
since then. So yeah,
Awesome.
keep
Really
keep
appreciate
writing,
you.
man. Yeah.
Thank you so much. You too. Likewise. Thank you so much.